I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zeiss Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Arcane Mark GM Tools, converting Pathfinder 1st Edition to Pathfinder 2nd Edition.
So there's a lot of different things to talk about here, and I think one general guiding overarching principle, though, is not to try to convert like tiny piece for piece, but instead to look at converting the heart and the core of the concept.
That's right. But first, we have to think about what do you have from Pathfinder 1st Edition that you love and you want to convert. Because when we're starting in a lot of things on our episodes, we say start with a concept. Well, in this case, what you're starting with is some piece of Pathfinder 1st Edition that you've decided that you want to carry over. Now, very commonly, that's an adventure. It often is. There's some really interesting themes in Pathfinder 1st Edition adventures that people sometimes are just like, I want to run that adventure, but I'd rather run it in Pathfinder 2nd Edition where like the math scaling doesn't get quite as out of control and there's not like hours of pre-buffing and certain other things that maybe they didn't want to have, but they did want to have the story from that adventure or adventure path. It's not the only thing that people ever want to convert from Pathfinder 1st to Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Obviously, you can convert a rules element you like, whether it be a magic item, a spell, or even a class. Or you could be converting a monster. I mean, heck, you might need to be converting multiple monsters even to convert an adventure, especially bespoke NPCs and creatures that appear in that adventure. So that's even sort of a subset of converting the adventures. You've got to do that. So right now we're going to be talking about generally converting Pathfinder 1st Edition to Pathfinder 2nd Edition GM tools. So as a GM, you're doing it for your group. If you are doing it not as a GM, but like commercially because you want to release it on Pathfinder Infinite, there's different steps and techniques that you would necessarily use. Falcariana gave an example of a friend who really wants to run Reign of Winter, but wants to do it in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Absolutely. I ran War for the Crown in Pathfinder 2nd Edition before Age of Ashes came out. There weren't any APs in PF2. There were only PF1 APs. And it was actually, I found that it was smoother and easier to convert to Pathfinder 2e than to prep for Pathfinder 1e in the first place, because generally in Pathfinder 1e, I could run amazing games in Pathfinder 1e with that even went up to very high levels. But I needed to rebuild like every possible stat block in the adventure, every encounter, all sorts of other elements of them, because depending on what your group was in Pathfinder 1e, and for some people here who started with 2e, you might not have experienced this, but I guess if you played the video games from Alcott, maybe you did. But depending on how optimized your group is and what your group's meta is, the degree of what they could handle varied wildly, from the as-published APs being too hard to the as-published APs being a child's play for one PC alone, and everything in between. So when you are converting to Pathfinder 2e, one thing that, if we start with adventures, because that's actually the most common, so you first find an adventure path that you really want to run.
So generally, if you're looking at existing adventures, the main story is going to work just fine. It's going to be a matter of converting the mechanics. There may be a few places where things get a little bit tricky around the edges if things rely on certain spells that got changed, like, you know, the classic example, somebody's teleporting in one round, and like, that doesn't happen. So you might need to fix those types of things, but generally the main things you're going to be looking at fixing are the encounters themselves. And in the encounters, you'll want to look at the encounter difficulty, because Pathfinder 1st Edition adventures are going to have some things that are super easy, but they're also going to have some that are like actually really hard. And you don't just want to be like, oh, well, this was a level +4 encounter in Pathfinder 1st Edition, so it should clearly be extreme in Pathfinder 2nd
First
Edition.
rarely actually put those in, because the two editions actually have fairly similar guidelines on which kind of encounters to build on, or how hard certain encounters to build are, but there are two differences. One is that it wasn't really correct in Pathfinder first, so some adventurers got away with building things way harder than they theoretically should have been, on the grounds that it's still easy for certain groups. And two, which is that Pathfinder 1E on the lower end had the opinion that like very trivial encounters were sometimes interesting to put in large numbers. They're definitely, I've dealt with dungeons with dozens of repetitive trivial encounters in them. And so you may run into those as well. So that's what Linda was saying with you don't necessarily want your conversion to just be sort of a look over and be like, oh, that was an encounter that was like that has 4 level 9 monsters or 4 CR9 in Pathfinder 1, so I'll put 4 level 9.
Yeah.
Not necessarily, because if you do that and figure out, oh, well, our party's level 16, it's like, you may want to do that just for a walkover, like once, to show how strong the party is, but then afterwards you might not want to have.
I mentioned that first because you want to know what your target encounter difficulty is before you start messing with the monsters or the other composition and things like that.
That's right.
Otherwise, you'll waste time.
So I think what you should actually do first is you need to familiarize yourself with the adventure path. And the good news is, unlike when you're running the brand newest new Pathfinder 2 adventure path, Stolen Fates, that just came out, and you're like, oh, but only the first adventure is out. It has a synopsis of everything, but you can't read the second and third adventure. Well, good news. All the Pathfinder First Edition adventures are completely out. So get them all for this AP that you're like really in love with, that you want to convert. Or if it's just a single adventure, well, you have them all because it's only one adventure. Read the whole thing. Read it all. Even if it's an AP and that's a lot of pages. Take a look through everything, see what's happening in the future so that you can tie things together, because in a new edition, you may need to tie them together in a different way.
Yeah.
And sometimes you might not expect it. Like, for example, an AP might say, just in the middle of Volume 3, it's like, well, you know, when the PCs were doing things in Volume 1, actually, this other person teleported away in one round. And you didn't realize that that was necessary in Volume 3 because it was just kind of assumed to have been happening in the background, and you needed to come up with a different alternative thing to do in Volume 1.
Another thing that you might see that's more broad-ranging are things like large point tracking mechanisms or global subsystems. Those are things that are good to take a look at, because, you know, if you have things that are like, oh yeah, you know, this assumes, you know, the DCs that are assumed and things like that, you'll need to change those around, or the skills that are assumed, or if things are like, oh yeah, you know, this gives you a +4 bonus, it's like, well, no, that's...
For example, the Persona system, which Linda created for War for the Crown in Pathfinder 1st Edition, I created a Pathfinder 2nd Edition version of that when I was running my home game of War for the Crown 2nd Edition, and I did that at the beginning so that I could let players know what was going on with it. And then I used sort of the work that I had done with that to help build the Academia subsystem for when I wrote that for Strength of Thousands. So, like, conversion work comes from figuring out what you need and then doing it. And to start off, that I would read the entire adventure or adventure path, make a few notes about anything that seems like there's not an easy conversion of it, or that seems like it's overarching or important, like Linda said. And some aspects of overarching subsystems actually might work fine. Like, if it's just a point tracking mechanisms of, like, you get one point if you stop the fire in Chapter 2, and 2 points if you save the prisoners in Chapter 3, then it's like, that's probably fine. So, to some degree, certain subsystems and trackers are system neutral. And you want to figure out, oh, does this have something that's very Pathfinder 1 in it?
Yeah. One of the main things that you're going to see that's very Pathfinder 1 is, like, if, like I was starting to get into there, like, the benefits that it gives to the characters, making sure that those are going to be balanced. And also, like, assumptions that it might be making about the kinds of DCs that PCs are going to be able to hit.
That's right. So, when you're looking at these things in the adventure, when you see DCs, that are just like a random. It's like, oh well, there's a wall in this dungeon, and it'll be like a climb DC of whatever. When you're converting to an athletics DC, you can use the tables in the Pathfinder core rulebook for second edition. Just even get the GM screen that has those tables on it, and use maybe a simple DC, or if it makes sense that the level of the dungeon's level, or the level of like the crafter who created the dungeon would be relevant, then use the level-based DC with adjustments of difficulty based on the situation. Oh, it's also covered in slime and it's harder, so it's therefore a hard or very hard.
Another thing when you're thinking about DCs and skill checks is to think about where lore might be relevant. This could be like if you're converting for your home group, think about like, oh yeah, I know that my players have these lores, so how might those come up? Or if you're converting something for a wider audience, thinking about that for, what are the lores from the core rulebook that might be relevant.
That's right.
Because that's a skill that's not going to be listed in any version.
If you have your home group and they already built their characters, then you also mostly only have to think about the lores that they actually took.
Yes.
Which is handy. It's like, oh, would the lores they actually took apply? If not, it doesn't matter, because yes, they can use lore untrained potentially, but they could then use any lore untrained, so you don't have to
So the
care.
ones that they have is what I was trying to get at.
So that is an element to which it makes sense to know what the characters are before you do all the conversion, but you should do some of the conversion, especially subsystems or other things that you can give them tips in session 0. Some of those overarching subsystems first, like how I redid the persona system.
Or if you're doing things in the other order, you might notice like, hey, wow, gosh, it really seems that architecture lore would appear constantly in this AP. So maybe I can suggest that someone consider taking architecture lore.
That's right. And Rico suggests to taunt your players with lots of lores they don't have, but I don't really recommend that. So then you've gone through, you've looked at the overarching challenges. You are going to now go back. When you have a good sense of the adventure path, run a session 0 with your players. Help them build characters. Use your knowledge from your first pass through to tell them if there's anything that changed from the player's guide. In fact, you may want to convert the player's guide.
Yeah.
Make some special backgrounds that are for the AP, and convert anything in the player's guide that it says that is like no longer true because of the way that things changed, or that changed somewhat. Like sometimes it's just being on top of what the names of things changed to, in case your players aren't like, oh, it suggested the language giant, but that's now called Yotun in second edition. That's an easy enough conversion. Sometimes it's more complicated than that because of the fact that it'll suggest something that just no longer even exists. And even sometimes if it no longer exists, it's not that hard. Like suggesting ranger favorite enemies to be racist against in Pathfinder 1st edition. Now you don't have racist rangers in 2nd edition, so you don't need to do that.
Yes.
You can just not tell them just to ignore that section, or make your own player's guide that just doesn't have it. But one of the key things is that you'll want to do like special backgrounds that tie into the adventure path, most likely, and those often replace the campaign traits, so it's easy enough to try to come up with a background that is similar to the old campaign traits.
Yeah, and backgrounds have a very formulaic way of building the standard background, so it's pretty straightforward to say, okay, I know what skill feat I want, I know what skills, and I know what ability scores are relevant.
If you want to get weird on it and raise the difficulty level, you could decide to make them rare backgrounds that have like really weird stuff in it. Generally, there'll be uncommon backgrounds that are uncommon because they're only for the AP and that do normal things. And you're doing it for your home group, so you don't need to remember to put the commonality trait on it. It just won't matter. And if you're releasing one that is for the public, like the Gatewalkers AP that didn't have this in it, do remember to put in the uncommon and rare traits on your backgrounds, because other people might wind up seeing them in a weird place, such as Archives of Nethys for the aforementioned Gatewalkers. But since this is mostly for GMs, it doesn't really matter if you just made them common. Who's going to use them again? Your players, in which case you'll be like, oh yeah, I forgot to put the uncommon on this. Obviously, the background of
where you
woke up amnesiac in strange aeons because you were secretly from France.
Yes,
is not one that is not an appropriate background for the we remember our grandparents AP that are not from France.
It's an obvious specific AP. We remember our grandparents that are not from France.
Yes, that's correct.
But yeah, so once you've got sort of the backgrounds and that gives you the conversion of the hook. Also, there's going to be a fair bit of monster conversion that's going to be taking place. Some of that you can do just by saying, okay, yeah, well, this says that there's a goblin here. Let's see about what the second edition version of a goblin is.
That's like the easiest easiest
level. Although
is
keep in mind that the levels of the creatures may have changed, so you might need to do some adjustment there.
Like Roper, a monster that just kind of sits around and then attacks you with tentacles and brings you closer, had just an obnoxiously high level in Pathfinder First Edition that was higher than like the gimmick should be, and also just meant that you couldn't encounter a Roper for a really long time. So they lost several levels. Usually in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, a monster is within about one level of its previous level.
And that means that you could, like, you could like,
apply Elite or Weak to get it back if you... But that's if you even needed a monster of exactly that same level, which we've already indicated. Pathfinder 1 has a lot of chances of having rooms and rooms full of trivial minus encounters that are lower than the maximum for trivial. Yeah. So you might not even want something of the same level anyway. So the easiest is when it's like, oh, it's an ogre. Oh, okay, I'll use an ogre. It's the same level as ogre. That's fine. The next more challenging one is where you need to get something that is kind of similar. So it'll be like in Pathfinder 1, your PCs are attacked by these ruffians. And these ruffians are... they're fighter rogues who used all their feats on skill-focused basket weaving, and they have 10 strength and dexterity with a +1 to hit because of their multi-class, and they're theoretically challenge rating 2. And they hit for 1d4 plus 0 with a limp noodle that they're holding in their hand, or something like that. And then you are like, okay, well, I don't have ruffians that have noodles and basket weaving, but... There is a level 2 NPC in the Game Mastery Guide in the Criminals section that might be similar.
Yeah, so use the Game Mastery Guide certainly as a source for NPCs if you're just looking for quick conversion rather than building your own. And you can also use it as a basis without like doing 100% of the same thing. So you're like, oh, this ruffian stat book is almost perfect, but actually this ruffian is a ruffian who works with a magic school, and therefore they have a cantrip, and they've got some pretty decent arcana. Like, you can make small adjustments.
Or you'd be like, I'll just change the damage to non-lethal bludgeoning because they're supposed to have a limp noodle, and just keep the rest of the stat block the same, and add basket weaving lore as a skill.
There you go. So you can use that, and you can also do that with monsters too. If you're like, well, the second edition version of the monster is pretty similar, but the first edition version had this one thing that I needed to have. It had this one skill or whatever. But when you're looking at like this one thing that I needed to have, this gets into monsters too. If you compare a lot of first edition monsters to second edition monsters, you'll see that second edition monsters are a lot less likely to be immune to various things. That's intentional, very much so. And they're also less likely to have like a sea of spell-like abilities that they wouldn't necessarily use.
Or a sea of random resistances.
Where
it's just like, oh, okay, it's a demon. I guess it's immune to electricity and then resistant to like nearly everything else for some reason. And it's like, why? And the answer is like in an old D&D like first edition like Fiend Folio or something, there was a list of things that they're like half damage and no damage and full damage, and those are the ones they picked. But in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, generally, you're not going to see those kind of immunities. If so, we're now moving on from just picking a creature that is similar to the hardest one, which is, well, there's nothing that is like this. So when you have that situation, you have a few choices. One of them is to just say, well, there's nothing that is like this. Good thing I can just pick a thing that already exists in Pathfinder 2e that is not like this. But maybe there's a piece of art of that creature that you want to show. Or maybe it's important that it literally is that creature. Or maybe you want to do a hard mode and just be like, to the spirit of the AP, it has to be all the same creatures. I won't replace this Trizzle with a troll, even though they're both kind of like regenerating creatures, but the Trizzle it looks like a crocodile, and it also has rend, and the troll does not look like a crocodile, and I cannot use a troll or even use the troll stats and call it a Trizzle. I need to make a new Trizzle.
Well, that's a little bit of a practical example, I think, because you're more likely to run in that situation when you're like, okay, there's not a corresponding creature.
Well, you'll eventually get to one where it's just like there's nothing even remotely similar, but you could also be in a case where there's not one that's remotely similar, and but you still could just put something else in, right? Like, if you have to deal with like some weird Pathfinder 1st Edition giant that didn't get converted, it's like, well, there's still like 12 giants or whatever.
So can you use one of the other types, or can you, or like, you know? If
but
it's
it
like
might be important for the story that it was the 1st Edition giant, and you could think about tweaking it, but you'd be like, no, I don't want to tweak the story. I'm not going to use a different giant. I'm not going to start with a different giant and then like change one ability and say it's the 1st Edition giant. I really want to just make this monster from scratch. And even in that case, it's not too bad. So what you do is you just use the building monster rules, which we've gone over before on the stream several times. You can probably not see the episode right now because it's Twitch will have taken it down, but someday if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll be able to see episodes about this on YouTube, and you just use the normal monster creation rules. But here's the cool thing. You have a Pathfinder 1st Edition version of this monster already. So if necessary, if you want to do what I was doing in War for the Crown a lot of the time, which is like not worry about spending a lot of time pre-converting and just convert it as you run it, then all you really need is to, I would suggest the advanced GM screen that has the monster building numbers on it, but you can also just open up your Game Mastery Guide or go to Nethys onto that page. You have to scroll a lot or flip a lot of pages if you do that, which is why I like the Game Mastery Guide where it's all there. But you just sit around with those numbers and just flat out every time that you are needing a monster, just look at the numbers and just hit. Yes, a more advanced creation that you're doing for a published book, you would think more carefully and sometimes go outside of the established high values and low values because you're doing something else. But this is just something you're doing in your game. You can absolutely just be like, okay, it's a brute, so higher hit points, lower AC.
So starting with picking which of those basic roadmaps that you want, so that way you don't run into the risk of like, oops, I picked too many high things. It's good at everything. Yeah,
I don't like having to flip pages or scroll up and down. So there's a few weird other tricks you can do if you don't want to use the GM screen for this and you're trying to do the quick creating monsters, especially since with quick creating monsters, like you probably don't want to have to like go back to it every time if you have multiple creatures. So you could use RPGSuperstar.com and just hit brute and the level and it will fill in some numbers. Now it does kind of see that like a brute may say something like, or soldier may say high to extreme AC, in which case RPGSuperstar.com like randomly picks high or extreme AC, and you may know that you don't want extreme, so do like pay a little attention to what it does, but it will fill in the numbers for you and make what looks like a creature step block over on the right, and you can use that to have something you could look at in one place, like within seconds of deciding the level on the roadmap. If you don't like RPGSuperstar.com, you could, I guess, like make your own spreadsheet that you put in the level, and it fills out values for you for everything for that level. Make some kind of visual aid or something so you can just toss in a level and see what the low, high, extreme, moderate values are for that level. Then you can just pick them quickly as you're running the monster. And when it comes to special abilities, see what the first edition one has and convert a few of them. If it has a million spell-like abilities, like Linda said, you do not want a million spell-like abilities.
And on the flip side, if the first edition monster didn't have special abilities,
like an owlbear, like when people talk about how the Pathfinder second edition owlbear has way more interesting, just way more abilities than the D&D 5e owlbear, but that's not just like a rag on 5e. Every edition had boring owlbears with barely anything, including Pathfinder First, where the owlbear was exactly the same monster as a dire tiger, except for like one minor variation. Even had the same. I think the tiger has pounce, and then like the numbers are almost exactly the same in the owlbear. They also have all the other abilities that the tiger has, and so it's like a weaker, and they're the same CR. So like, kind of every edition before Pathfinder 2nd edition had some creatures that just like sort of, I guess, traditionally in D&D had a few very simple and not that interesting abilities, and they just kind of continue to give them those. So if you see that there's nothing that's particularly interesting about the creature, come up with like one new thing. Just that's sometimes difficult to do on the fly, so you don't have to. You can, because here's the secret. You know, we talk about Pathfinder 2 when the owlbear's having those interesting abilities, right? But guess what? For decades, they didn't, and people still liked owlbears.
Yeah. So when you're coming with abilities, like, I would also recommend looking at just, like, the general monster rules for those kind of universal abilities and how they work. Because, you know, the pounce type stuff may not be the most creative, but it's still more interesting to have that on a creature than to not have something.
Yes,
you can
and
also
it's not a universal rule, so you'll have to look carefully for a creature with pounce.
Yeah, well, the type, you're right. Pounce.
There's first of all universal rules in the back of the bestiary. Those are great, but what Linda's talking about there, you probably already knew to go to the back of the bestiary. What Linda's talking about there's certain abilities that are the same a lot of times, but aren't in there. There's just a lot of creatures that have it.
So if you're looking at like Archives of Nethys or something, you can look for like an ability by name, or like look for monsters that have an ability and be like, I know that I like this ability that this monster has, so I'd like to go ahead and port that over.
Yeah.
Because if you take a pre-made second edition ability, then all you got to do is make sure that the DCs and the numbers are correct for something of your level.
And that it's an appropriate ability for your level. If you're like, well, the monster Lesser Death has this in Pathfinder 2e, so that probably means my third level owlbear, baby owlbear could have it.
Yeah. Generally, like, if it's level, if it's level plus or minus 1, it's gonna be fine. But if there's an ability that's from something that's way off in level, you might be able to find like a different version of it. Like, let's say that there's a creature that has something that's a high level 1, and it's like, oh yeah, this is gonna make you like sick in 3 or some nonsense if you fail. Where you may be able to have a lower level ones where it's like, oh yeah, it's a lesser
that
stench thing then makes you sick in 1 instead, because that's more appropriate for the level. And keep the theme, but change the numbers.
So Rico puts out owlbears are creatures that make people happy even if the execution is bland, and that's true. So you don't have to hold yourself up to the standard of putting in lots of abilities if you don't have time, because you're just doing it on the fly. You can just make it not have that much, and people may still enjoy it just because it's a cool-looking creature, like they did with owlbears for decades. So Dalvin has a question. The guidelines for encounters at PF2 assume the party starts each encounter with nearly full renewable resources. Some PF1 adventures sometimes challenge PCs with sequences of encounter that do not allow for breaks. Any guidelines about how to convert those and design balanced sequences of encounters that would challenge PCs through attrition in PF2? So, in general, PF2 does not necessarily assume that you're going to start with everything, but it's certainly the case that PF2 is going to work better if you either start with high resources, or if the series of encounters are so packed in there that your long-lasting buffs, or even your minute buffs from the first encounter may apply to the second one because the enemies rush in right away. But your absolute worst case scenario in PF2 is like, okay, we finish this fight. 4 minutes later, there's a second fight. 4 minutes later, there's a third fight. 4 minutes later, there's a fourth fight. 4 minutes later, there's a fifth fight. 4 minutes later, there's a sixth fight. 4 minutes later, there's a seventh fight.
So you can't rest and
you can never do a 10-minute rest. You can never keep your buffs, and at least you have time to heal up in between, but you might have chosen not to because you started doing a 10-minute rest and you didn't know that 4 minutes later you were going to get attacked 7 times in a row.
Yeah.
So you may want to just, like, literally avoid doing something like that. Anytime that there could be 4 minutes in between it, you could probably come up with an excuse to make it 10 minutes.
Yeah. And then this gets back into what Mark was talking about before about, like, you know, if there's a sequence of very easy encounters, like, that's just gonna... Changing that into fewer, more challenging encounters.
Or keep it as a sequence of very easy encounters. Your PCs will... A lot of times when you have all those encounters in PF1, when you look at it, they'll be, like, all trivial in PF2. You're like, oh, yeah, because... PF1 thought that having 4 level 3 PCs beat up on a CR3 monster, which is the same amount of a blowout as it is in PF2, but they didn't call it trivial back then. They called it, like, I don't even remember. It was like standard or something like that, even though standard was 4-on-1ing someone of your own power level.
Yeah.
And so just don't use the tips that we gave you earlier of converting them to actually be harder and just let them be trivial.
Yeah,
your PCs are going to lose, unless your PCs are just like, I guess, even if your PCs are foolish and blow out all their focus points on ridiculously easy encounters because they're like, well, I want to show off more than this other person, so I'm going to do this. They still won't lose a lot of hit points in a trivial encounter.
You may still want to step it up to like the top of trivial, just so that it is a little more.
It depends on how many are in a row and if they're going to lose their buffs.
Well, I mean, but the thing is though that like for those, like if you have a lot of trivial encounters in a row, like trivial encounters don't, particularly the ones that are not the highest level, typically don't give XP by default.
Correct.
So you may then want to consider if you're doing something that's like a rolling waves of trivial encounters that don't let you rest in the middle and this or
I would give a story
or whatever,
award
then you can give a story award. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I would absolutely give a story award. But it's important to note that, in fact, I would not give a story award that was equal to, like, what the XP value of that encounter would be if it wasn't trivial, because that sometimes doesn't... Like, 2 trivial encounters that are each half of a moderate encounter that you fight one and then quickly fight the other while your buffs are still up, but not together, are way easier than a moderate encounter that is made up of all of those things at the same time. In fact, sometimes fighting the second trivial encounter without a 10-minute rest is actually easier than fighting it with the rest, because of the fact that you have, if you have up buffs or some kind of situational stuff, or even if you don't have buff spells, if like your stance is active still because the other waves came in and the counter didn't end, and your barbarian rage is still on and you easily won and you're not at risk of running out of the duration of rage because the fight was trivial, you could actually wind up in a situation, you know, your inventor did a critical overdrive and that's still up. You can wind up in a situation where it's actually easier to fight the second half than it is to fight the first half. Obviously, if both of the encounters are very hard, that's rarely going to be true. Although, again, it can sometimes be true if it was so hard that your party put up a bunch of obnoxiously powerful buffs, and then they're still active, and you don't need the rounds to put up the buffs while the other ridiculously hard encounter charges in. It also depends on how much in-combat healing your group has, because if they don't, the obnoxiously hard first encounter is very likely to have left them too low on health, even if they have a lot of buffs up.
I would say generally that if you're looking for attrition, low threat encounters are a good way to go, because they're something that can take some resources without, like, being too risky individually.
Yes, I do recommend low threat encounters, but if you have quite a series of them, and it's also ones where you don't keep the buffs because several minutes but not 10 minutes pass, that could wind up attritioning the group too much by the end, but it is true that they're unlikely to cause too much attrition, even if you have like 3 or 4 low threat encounters in a row while losing buffs but not having enough time to do a 10-minute rest. Also, at some point, I think the PCs will get savvy that you interrupted them 4 minutes like twice and be like, well, that might happen again. I guess we'll use our potions and back up because we have actually lost some health after the third low threat encounter. So just like don't do that with a series of severe or even moderate encounters. And if the PF1 adventure is written like that, just change it. Like, don't do it. That's just in the same way we said that when it's not a series of encounters, like it's just like, oh, you're going through this dungeon and there sure are 10 rooms with like all have 2 of these really easy rogue stat blocks and 2 dark creepers and you're level 11.
Yeah.
Like, that's a real Pathfinder First Edition dungeon. I won't spoil which AP it's in because then you'll know that AP. There's a real dungeon that's like that.
But I might consider
so in the same way that we said to make those harder, well, nothing's stopping you from making the encounters easier when you know that they chain and that they would have all been severe.
But if you're like, yeah, you know, I don't want to run that many super easy encounters, you can do things like having more of the saying, oh yeah, no, more of them are in the same room so they combine up, or there's fewer of them, or they're more challenging, or heck, you know, you have a troop of weak rogues that all come in and attack.
Yeah.
To represent the numbers.
Nothing is saying when you're converting it that you have to keep the same number of encounters and make them easier. You absolutely, like Linda had said it even earlier in the episode, can take the same difficulty of encounters and make there be fewer, or do some kind of in-between where, oh, well, you know, there were 12 moderates in a row, but I've changed that to 2 severes with a break in between, or something like that.
Or Enrico said, or change a bunch of encounters into a subsystem. Yeah, you can totally do that. You could be like, okay, yeah, now we're going to have like we're going to be doing an infiltration to describe how you get
or
into
you could just make a killing those really easy rogues and dark stalkers subsystem, where just like each of the rooms is like a like, let's see. So the subsystem is we're making is killing all those easy rogues and dark stalkers. So here's how I would describe it. It's like a chase, except for that either there's a timer on it because you decide like you need to kill them before like the actual important characters find out, or it's sort of Legolas and Gimli who are like competing to be like that only counts as one, and where the PCs go around rolling different kinds of checks to determine how they slaughtered the easy rogues and dark stalkers who are in that particular room. Then they move on to the next room, and you like say, oh well, this time the rogues and dark stalkers like were like up on a wall, so you might need to use athletics to get to them to kill them, and you just roll kind of some skills and just talk about how you killed them. And then if you don't do
as well, then maybe like one of them gets away and it raises an alarm that makes things harder in later rooms or something like that.
That's right. So, like, you could turn that whole thing into a subsystem so that you don't have to run literally over a dozen encounters of easy rogue, stat block, and dark stalkers.
Yeah, well, just like when running those in first edition, like I'd often try to be like, okay, well, let's cut some of these encounters out or change some of them into something different. And you can also do that too and be like, okay, well.
Yeah, I mean, you were running that in first edition. Yeah. That same dungeon, and you just cut some of the encounters out.
Just cut some out, or say like, okay, yeah, you know, I'll keep a couple of these, but I'll replace some of them with like some like rangery types who were helping them out, or like, you know, okay, they had like a cleric who was doing some things in their group, so then we switch it out for that.
I had a dungeon once that I actually think was not just it's another room with these guys, but did have mook fighter rogues that were kind of. There was, like, I think fighter rogues and then regular fighters. And those 2 stat blocks were used almost everywhere. But they always had, like, interesting, like, this time they have a wall. And this time there are these pillars. So the encounters were still probably kind of interesting. But all I did is I actually kept that. I made them better fighter rogues and fighters because they were, like, very weird builds. And then I created a bard and oracle mook build for that, and I sprinkled every time there was a group of like 8 of those fighter rogues and fighters, I would instead replace 2 of them with 1 of the bards and 1 of the oracles. And that, plus the fact that they already thought about the fact that they were the same kind of creatures and put interesting terrain and other twists on it, made the PCs actually felt very interested in those encounters, even though they were often running into this kind of standard type of enemy that lived in the dungeon with some kind of combination of their fighter rogues, their fighters, their one oracle, and their one bard.
Yeah.
So I think that there's ways that you can do this that will work out, even if there's some weird decisions that are in the dungeon in Pathfinder 1, and that will also help you if there's a weird series of encounters.
Yeah. And, sometimes with adventure paths, it's like, oh, well, the reason that wound up that way with that stat book getting repeated is you're running out of space.
Yeah, how would you have enough space?
How would you have enough space?
But you have as much space as you want.
You have as much space as you want, exactly.
Like, I know that adventure path that had all those encounters would not have had the space for it if they tried to put in more things. Dalvin says the subsystem idea is great to give some agency over how they reach their goal while avoiding dozens of rounds of combat. Yeah, absolutely. It only really works if they buy in. Obviously, sometimes people want to do a fight when they're like, well, my PC would easily win this battle. Whereas in the subsystem, there's a chance that I don't because I failed the skill check. So make sure it's something that the PCs are interested in. Like, they want to do the Legolas and Gimli. Or you'd be like, listen, if we ran this in combat, eventually one of them would get like a nat 20 on initiative and just run away. So we're doing it in this way because it gives you a better chance of getting a perfect clear.
Oh man, it reminds me of when we were doing like in the first campaign that I was ever in, we had a stage near the end where we're like, let's just go around and do random quests throughout the world to try to get more money. And we
wait, you didn't do the random quest.
Or how people do random quests,
You had the bard sketchily wear a cloak, go into a tavern and hire adventurers.
And then the player was initially like, well, they would obviously succeed or whatever. Then we played one out and we just rolled absolutely terribly. It's like, oh, I guess.
Because I had been giving there to be a chance that they would run into some trouble just based on bad rolls. And then the bard player's like, this is ridiculous. I'm going to give them all a bead of friends so they could just summon me and one of the other PCs and we'll just annihilate it because we're way higher level than the adventurers we're sending out.
Yeah.
And just like somehow it was like a cavalcade of failures and like the enemies like managed to, like they used like some kind of dagger or poison or something that in Pathfinder, or it was in 3.5 that like has a DC that is like basically zero but like, then the player rolled a natural 1 like multiple times in a row against the poison and got paralyzed. The one that the bard brought, who was actually like a beater. Yeah. And the bard was completely support. And then like ogres that were there were helping the poisoning person just crit constantly against the other people who were there, and the bard still managed to win it, but the bard player was like, holy crap. Yeah, I guess there should be some chance that something happens. Because that was just like, how many 20s could they get and how many 1s could we get?
Yep. So I think for our whole group, that was definitely like the lesson of like, sometimes things will go, sometimes you have that chance where things will mess up.
I still enjoyed the fact that bard was like a source for those sketchy cloaked figures. And there was like a legitimate reason for why the bard did that. Because most of the time it's like, why doesn't this high level cloaked figure who turns out to be a 17th level adventurer just do the quest? And the answer there was that the bard was farming money and ingredients to summon demons when there was only a limited amount of time before the enemy completed his ritual within like a year, and the bard wanted to get as much as possible and was very good at gathering information, so would find quests, send people out on the quests, and then eventually decided to change it out to like send them out on the quest, and then they just get the PCs to all come in and just do the quest when they get there. I mean, the bard started out by just saying, I'll just do all the quests, but the problem was that like the party was unable to find the party was very strong at fighting, but was like not good at like, I will just find where these goblins are who have been attacking the horses in this town. It's like, it could take other groups days. At the party only took hours, but that still took hours. And the bard was thinking it would just take a minute and then it would be done.
So then the other groups would, so then we'd hire like the lower level adventurers and be like, your job is to find the goblins. Then once you find the goblins, we'll teleport to you, give you some money, and then you go home while we do the quest.
That's right.
And the bard had no trouble finding people to agree to that because they didn't have to like actually get in combat or anything.
That's right, and it became the source of these sketchy cloaked figures. So, let's see. We talked about converting encounters and creatures. That's really your biggest thing.
So NPCs, I would say too, like you know, if you look at the classes that are listed, you could use those as a guide for what kinds of classes, what kind of class roadmaps you might want to use.
Yeah, especially if that class has a roadmap in Pathfinder 2 Game Mastery Guide, you can just follow that. If not, you can just convert some of their key abilities into some kind of Pathfinder 2 version. So it's like, it's a mesmerist. Okay, I'll give them a weird stare. Yeah. And then also occult spells. And that should probably be fine. You're also going to have to convert hazards, and this is an opportunity because Pathfinder 1 didn't really have a way of describing complex hazards as much, but you might be able to have more fun with a complex hazard. And I often did this. Like in War for the Crown, there was a room with like a fiend in it and then like a simple hazard, but I turned it into a complex hazard that was continually doing some weird stuff. It was another one of those too easy encounters, but I made it harder by, because that exact kind of fiend, I just wanted to use the PF2 version of it, but I made it harder by making it a complex hazard that was worth a lot more XP.
Yeah, and complex hazards can be, I find, even easier to convert on the fly than monsters because hazards have fewer like numbers that you're dealing with. And see, you just need like that core like ability that does. And is it like, you know, especially if it's like a really basic, like, oh, you know, it shoots a poison dart at you or whatever, find a level appropriate poison and stick that on the thing and do the damage, and then you're fine.
That's right. So Numbat is wondering about converting items, specifically items for a magus. So when it comes to...
probably magic, I think.
Are you sure? Because well, I mean, I guess it could have been missing a C, but I was thinking it was for Magus because they use a lot different items in Pathfinder 2nd. Like they're not like crit fishing with a scimitar. It's yes, which could be either one.
Magic.
But yes, magic. Okay.
Yes.
So when you're converting items, I would recommend, especially if it's in an adventure, just like look at what level the adventure is and use items that already exist in the Pathfinder core rulebook. And so you can go there and Linda is the non-literal reading expert, says Rika.
Yeah, no, like
I had this whole thing where I was thinking, yeah, you would need to change the items that that Magi are using in your adventure.
Well, like Mark, we've talked about this because Mark is like, well, if I don't take what they say at face value, then I'm like putting words in their mouth, and I'm like, well, you know, they really probably meant that, so. Yep.
Try to find an item that's of about the appropriate item level, even if it's completely different than the item in Pathfinder 1st that was there. Like, if there's, like, a strength item and it's not level 17, you probably shouldn't be putting an apex strength item there.
Yes.
For example. Although, sometimes you can if you feel like it. Like, at one point, I think I threw in an apex item at just, like, level 14. They're like, yeah, it's 3 levels too early.
Yeah.
It was also a obnoxiously expensive item for its level in Pathfinder 1st edition too. One that was like, wow, this value is way above what you would expect. And it was from like a high priest of this old temple that left it there. And so I put an Apex Wisdom item. And PCs were freaking out about it. You could do that.
Yeah.
Now, if you're talking specifically about... It's not just that they had an item that no longer exists in Pathfinder 2e, and you just want to know what item do I even drop in the adventure, but it's like, no, there's like a special item in the adventure, and I need to like actually build a new item. Or you're not even converting an adventure. You just saw an item in Pathfinder 1, and we're like, let's convert it into Pathfinder 2. Here's how you do. Start out by saying, don't be the Jurassic Park scientists, okay? Because they were only asking whether they can... But they didn't ask whether they should.
Yes.
So ask whether you should convert the item. Okay? Because it could be that, especially if it's an item that was not just in the adventure, or not just you thought it was cool, but was an item that your kind of cagey power gaming person in your group who played a lot of Pathfinder 1 just kind of gives you a small sly smile and says, oh, this could be a good item to convert into Pathfinder 2. You may want to think about, like, whether that item doesn't, especially if they're like, it was really popular in Pathfinder 1. Maybe it wasn't converted for a reason.
Yes.
But let's say you've determined that it should be converted. Rico has this original printing quick runner shirt. Yes. There you go. So for a lot of those things, didn't like Pathfinder 2 do a quick runner shirt that was like not busted?
I think it did eventually, yeah.
Yeah, so like for a lot of those items, like I was just like, if someone wanted to convert it like in a book for PF2, when I was at Paizo, I would be like, yes, let's do it, and we'll make it not busted so that we know that down the line, if we're not paying attention and there's not enough time, and then somebody does it in like a book we're not expecting, and we don't get a pass on it, that there won't be a busted version of this item. Yeah, I thought it was in Grand Bazaar.
So a few things to look at for there, are definitely, and you alluded to this, but the Apex items like bonuses come online at come online at way different times. You're going to want to look at that, like that little chart in creating magic items. It's like, hey, this is when you would get these types of bonuses for things. And if there's an item that just gives bonuses, you generally don't see that as much in Pathfinder 2. Items are usually going to be like a bonus and some other interesting thing that's going on it. But that's probably not what inspired you the most. If you're bothering to convert it, it's probably something that has some kind of cool ability.
I mean, it may have inspired your Power Gaming player. They're like, I want a Tingasa of the Fortunate Soldier, and it should give me 1 AC that stacks with everything and negates criticals.
Yes. So then looking at...
And since once per day is probably more than the number of criticals I would take in Pathfinder 1E, because it is, and you would rarely actually take more than 1 critical per day, it's not fair to change it to once per day in 2E, because you actually can take a lot more criticals because that. Maybe once per round. And it gives a +1 untyped bonus. I know it says in the core rulebook that there are no untyped bonuses in Pathfinder 2E, and you can't do that. But I think we can make an exception for this because luck bonuses don't exist, right? So
don't do that.
Don't do this.
Yes, bad idea. But if you're looking at like the powers of items, if it's something that's like, oh yeah, it's this spell, there's guidelines in the magic items section for the Game Master Guide of like items. That'll tell you like, oh yeah, at what level of an item would have like spells of this kind of thing. And if it's a different power, look, spells and character abilities are still and feats are still a good source of inspiration for like, at around what level might something come online, and then you can sort of think about like, oh yeah, well, you don't have these abilities until like much higher level normally. So having something like this in an item would be troublesome.
So Rico says make the hat a fortune effect, so it also has bizarre mechanical interactions. I don't think you can make an AC booster a fortune effect because fortune effects have to affect one of your rolls.
Yeah.
Misfortune effects that you put on like an opponent's roll, I guess you could make the hat a misfortune effect on attack rolls against you.
Yeah.
But if it was fortune, since you never roll AC, now like theoretically, I guess you could roll an armor check. Rico says I'm underestimating the power of converting something badly. You're right. I mean, someone could put in an armor check into the conversion.
Well, I think that does.
They'd be like, well, breastplate. In this breastplate item says it has an armor check penalty. So I should convert this with an armor check where you roll your AC -10 plus 1d20 to see if you get the penalty.
Yes.
And it's got a fortune effect. Oh, you're using True Strike? My hat negates... Okay, so Rico, that is actually the thing I suggested, which is instead of making it a fortune effect that is nebulously for AC, call it a misfortune effect on the attack roll of the person who's attacking you. And then it would be, oh, you're using True Strike, my hat negates it, because you also have a misfortune effect from my hat. Or the misfortune is that you have to deal with someone who wants to convert the Tingasa of the Fortunate Soldier. Okay. So, sorry, Linda, what were you going to say?
I lost my train of thought.
No, that makes sense.
What was I talking about?
We were talking about converting items using the Game Mastery Guide.
Oh yeah, right. I was gonna say that like in the same way that like an item's not going to give you like an item of level 7 isn't going to give you like the spells that a 7th level person could cast. If you're looking to other abilities for inspiration, you're going to want to make sure that it comes online at a higher level than a person would otherwise be able to get that ability.
Yeah, absolutely. So, that's one way that you can try to convert items. Now, if you're also trying to convert, a spell, just try to compare it to similar spells. A lot of spells in Pathfinder 1E were like ridiculous incapacitation effects that wound up at a very low level due to the fact that core ridiculous incapacitation effects were at a very low level, and it was hard to claim that the ridiculous incapacitation effect was stronger than the core one. Like, for example, I remember very, like, sort of vividly, there was some kind of spell in Occult Adventures that makes you lose all of your abilities. And then each round you can try to get all of your abilities back. Yeah. And it was like, that sounds pretty ridiculous, but I think it was like level 2 or 3 or something like that, or like a pretty low level.
Because if you're paralyzed, then you also lose all your abilities.
And I was like, oh my gosh, I guess there's a ton of ways to automatically win in Pathfinder 1E. And then the next person who was looking at it also was like, Mark, I see you were fine with this. Like, I was pretty new at the time too. I see you were fine with this, but it's really ridiculous, right? This spell at this level. I was like, yeah, I thought it was ridiculous too, but here's 4 other spells where you lose your entire turn. At least in this version, you can run away or like make a basic attack even though you lost all of your abilities. And they're like, oh yeah, wow, yeah, that's a good point. And so we kept it, and then players looked at it and were like, wow, this is ridiculous. They lose all of their abilities. But then other players were like, well, you could just make them lose their entire turn. So the point is, there's a lot of things that are spells in Pathfinder 1st Edition that are ridiculous incapacitation effects that should be much higher level than they are in Pathfinder.
So you can look at things for that, like, making that effect a much higher level effect. You can look at something, having a reduced effect, or if you do want to retain some element of that really nasty thing, make it a critical failure result.
Yep. And
take a look at
even
some of the
then,
spells.
It may need to be a higher level.
Take a look at the spells that exist that are incapacitation spells for examples of how that's navigated on a level by level basis.
That's right. Because like in Pathfinder 1, some classes got flat out hold person, aka paralyzed, as a 2nd level spell. Some got it as a 3rd. In Pathfinder 2, everyone gets it as a 3rd. Therefore, you don't have to compare 2nd level spells to paralyze anymore. Therefore, a whole category of spell that would have been put at 2nd level in Pathfinder 1 would also be at 3rd level in Pathfinder 2.
Yeah. And there's also some things like, and then you can also consider rituals as an option. Like, let's say that you have a situation where you're like, this used to be something that could be done with a spell in Pathfinder 1st Edition, and I kind of need it for something that the bad guys set up over a long period of time. You can just handwave and say, yeah, they did a ritual to get this effect so that you can have this particular ward that you need or whatever.
Also, even more so than items, spells are in the Jurassic Park. We know we can, but should we? The answer is often no, because Pathfinder 1st Edition was full of spells that just like bizarrely and bustedly made casters just obsolete everybody else. From a psychic spell that gave you plus 20 to all the 20 rolls for a fairly long period of time, to spells that just kind of automatically replaced a whole category of skill checks and beyond. There's a lot more cases. With a magic item, actually, probably you're not going to find out that you shouldn't convert it, unless it was just a bonus item that, like, weirdly stacked, like we were talking about before. A lot of them, the answer is yes, you just have to be clever about it. But with spells, the answer is more likely to be no. We were pretty deliberative about getting rid of some of those spells that were causing problems, or replacing them. You can think of a way to change their effects so it's more of a collaborative effort with the rest of the party, but there just might not be a way to do that, because ultimately the spell at its core might just be a spell that does that. And that's okay. Also, a lot of the spells in Pathfinder 1E just gave random bonuses that stacked with everything else. So you could cast, like, we, like many other groups, and anyone who plays, like, the Alcat games knows this, like, had hours that were spent finding all the buff spells and who was going to provide them and what NPC they could hit up for long-lasting buff spells before going into a big encounter.
I really need infernal healing for wand exploits for some reason. Yeah.
Dun, dun. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, so it's like if you're looking at it, like, is what the spell does worthwhile? And if so, like, does it break the game? Is it something that can already be done with the spells that exist?
Exactly. So there are other things that you might wind up converting to, like an archetype or a prestige class. That you found in Pathfinder 1st Edition, you want to bring it into Pathfinder 2nd Edition, or even a class. Mm-hmm. Those are a lot more complicated, and you're going to have to be much more holistic. Even when we said for creatures and on adventures, those things to do it holistically and not try to do it point by point, you can kind of do adventures mostly point by point. You can even do creatures that you build their numbers up with Pathfinder 2, but try to convert a few of their abilities flat out from Pathfinder 1 into a new reimagining in Pathfinder 2. When you're doing a class or like an archetype or prestige class, you really have to reimagine it. Mm-hmm. Make it tell the same story. Make it hit the same beats in a ludonarrative perspective for the player, but do it with very different abilities.
Yeah. So, like, for, thinking about sort of the core things, like for the fighter class, the fact that fighters were very accurate was something that was important.
They were accurate. They knew how to use certain weapons,
and they had, like,
And they had lots of, like, combatish feat type things. They were known for being, like, very well trained and tactically minded in those kind of things.
So take it to sort of that level of stuff, and then, like, if they're a spellcaster, be like, okay, what spellcasting tradition would they use?
Falco Rhiannon wants to convert mythic rules. Well, for now, you could use cheats from Battlezoo Otherworlders if you want, instead of mythic rules. They're a lot lighter, so they're easier to apply, but just be like, yeah, your character has cheat level abilities. If you want to get really out of control, give people double S abilities that automatically break the game.
Crack it in half.
Crack it in half, and
crack it in half. Crack the world in half with your infinite gacha that's spewing 6,000 items onto the ground every round.
Yes, there you go. Or just destroy all magic everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And then as well as everyone who has magic on them.
Yes.
Yep.
There you go. So, basically when you're converting the TLDR or TLDW for the episode is find the high concept of the thing that you're looking at. You don't always have to convert it directly, especially if the concept was cool, but the actual abilities in PF1 were just, this is all bonuses. It sounds cool because it was like a mushroom hat, but all it did was give a +2 fungal bonus to all saving throws against diseases and poisons, and a +3 polka dot bonus to armor class. Then you can just still have a mushroom hat and give it something cool, like it shoots out mushroom spores as a special action or something like that. Or
lets you, like, walk on a carpet of fungus so that, like, if you fall, then it's like you have cat fall, or, like...
Yeah, so you could even, like, change...
Or you can use to make a spore attack once per day.
You could even change the abilities, like, completely. So they're unrecognizable and nothing remains of the old abilities, and keep the concept and the idea of the thing. But a lot of the time, you can actually follow all the notes from Pathfinder 1st Edition and just fill in the numbers and the values using the 2nd Edition rules to build it, not sort of from the ground up, but sort of not, because you've got this skeletal structure to look at and you've got ideas. If you do that and you get used to it, you probably can do it on the fly and convert Pathfinder 1st Edition to Pathfinder 2nd Edition without prep time. Now, it takes a lot of work to get used to it. I'm not guaranteeing that will work for everyone. Obviously, the fact that I can do it doesn't tell you anything, because I have a very unfair advantage of knowledge of Pathfinder 2. And the idea of making a new game system out of an old game system makes you an expert at converting those.
Yeah, but like you were saying before, having resources on hand to be able to do things quickly. Or, for example, like if you know, I want these... you may not need to have everything completely written out in detail. If you're like, okay, yeah, I know I want to have this monster, and here's the abilities that I'm going to give it, and I can grab the numbers while I'm running.
Yep. So, I think that covers our best tips and tricks for converting Pathfinder First Edition to Pathfinder Second Edition. I think we answered all of the questions in chat. So let's say bye to YouTube and then do our outro with folks. Bye, YouTube. See you next time.